Good evening, everyone. Benedict Lecca here, Executive Director of the Redwood Library, presenting this evening from the Carpenter Room upstairs, where we get better reception. I want to welcome you all this evening for another fine talk with a top specialist. Tonight's speaker is Ted Widmer, and many of you watching tonight know him well. He has spoken at the Redwood multiple times, has a long history with the Redwood, Newport, and Rhode Island more generally. He is going to speak to us about his new book, Lincoln on the Verge. And people have been going on and on and on about his book for weeks now. So we're thrilled to have him. For those of you who are less familiar with Mr. Widmer, he is distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College, CUNY. In addition to his teaching, he writes actively about American history in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. So some substantial publications. He grew up in Rhode Island and attended Harvard University. So we are dealing with a very distinguished speaker indeed. And so I'm going to have him come talk to us tonight. And I invite everyone to post your questions. We'd be thrilled to have a discussion after with Mr. Widmer, who can answer all the questions. So please welcome Mr. Ted Widmer. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Benedict. What a lovely introduction. So nice to be with so many of my fellow Rhode Islanders, albeit virtually, but still nice to be with you. I'm not too many miles away. I'm in Providence, slightly less interesting city, a few miles north of Newport. But I have many, many friends in Newport, and I really cherish my Newport friendships. And they include John and Yetta Gillette, and Ron Cowley, and Julie Warburg, Ron Fleming, and many, many others. And it's a joy for me to come to Newport. In fact, the last week, not related to this talk, I've been rereading Antoinette Downing's incredible book about Newport, which is one of the best books, I believe, ever written by an architectural historian about any community in the United States. It's just incredible. So I want to talk about my book, and I will, and that's why you all are here. But if you want to just talk about Newport or Rhode Island, I have also spent a lot of my life thinking about this strange state that we are all from, and the ways that it works and sometimes doesn't work so well. And if you want to talk about early Rhode Island history, I have a strong interest in the 17th century. And well, I don't want to say too much because I want to get into my book, but I'm really delighted to be with you. Oh, and I forgot to mention Angela Brown Fisher and Gary Fisher, dear friends, also in Newport. So I grew up thinking a lot about Abraham Lincoln and thinking a lot about railroads, and they were separate trains of thought for a long time until in 2010 and 2011, I began to think of a way to write about the two trains of thought at the same time. Why did I love Lincoln? Lincoln calls out to people. He is compelling. I read the kinds of biographies that are written for children around 4th grade, 5th grade, and I remember vividly the Lincoln book I read from my school library, and I actually have a copy of that book now given to me by my elementary school in Rhode Island. There was something about the sadness of his features and the beauty of his language and the beauty of his life story that was compelling. And of course, a sense of tragedy hangs over his life. And even as young history readers, we are aware of that. And then separately, I loved taking trains. They were exciting. My father had a model train set in the basement, and we used to go out train spotting. We'd look at trains. You can still hear them in Providence tooting their horns in the middle of the night. It's a beautiful sound, probably not audible in Newport. And it's one of the few ways in which Newport suffers in comparison to Providence. But Providence, of course, is right on Amtrak. And I used to take Amtrak a fair amount to get up to Boston, where I went to college, and to get to New York. And the fact that Amtrak and its predecessor railroads went through Providence and not a more central route through New England was one of the greatest things that ever happened to the state of Rhode Island, in my opinion, because Rhode Island, a lot of people in Boston didn't especially like Rhode Island, and it's important that we were connected to this great national network that was coming into being. And when I was about 8 years old, I went on an overnight train trip, which you could still do back then, to Washington, D.C., and got out at about 6:30 in the morning and saw the Capitol as the sun was rising. And I think that feeling was still with me as I was writing this book. The way the book began, in the fall of 2010, some historians I was friendly with got together, and we proposed that the New York Times run a series on the beginning of the Civil War that would be embedded within the online section of the online opinion page of the New York Times. And that series was called Disunion. It was a kind of dipping of a toe in the water of digital history. New for everybody. It was new for the historians writing. It was new for the New York Times, which still thought of the digital sections of the paper as kind of a backyard. Wasn't very interesting. Now, of course, 10 years later, the digital New York Times is everything. And the printed paper is less and less important. I hate to say that because it's still very important to me, but it's the reading experience goes on all day long. We read the Times through our laptops and our phones, and what is online has become more important. And when this Civil War project started, that was not yet known. This was a kind of experiment about putting new kinds of content onto the New York Times website. And it was electrifying. It was some of the most exciting history work I've ever been a part of. And I mainly mean that as a reader of other people's work, including my very good friend Adam Goodhart, who wrote a book called 1861 about the beginning of the Civil War, who was really kind of showing the way for the rest of us. But I was not especially young. I was already quite middle-aged, but I could sense that there was a faster kind of history being written, and that it was immersive and included illustrations and included Q&A from audience members immediately after writing something. You'd get Q&A from audience members, kind of like our Zoom call tonight. And it felt refreshing. It felt exciting in a way that history, we all love history, but it can be remote. It can be slow and remote and involve fastidious work over many years, then put into a published form that takes a long time to get out to people. And here was something very different. It was an immediate gratification. And as I got involved with this online history project, I just got more and more excited. And I started thinking in new ways. And I began to think, what could I do in this format that would make a good long series of essays, long series of sort of bloggy essays. And I was following Lincoln carefully over the winter of 1860 and 61. We were in an anniversary moment. We were in the 150th of Lincoln's election and his inauguration. And I thought, well, why not follow Lincoln on the train from Illinois to Washington? That's a kind of natural subject for a series of online essays, because I can do one essay every day following him where he is, and put up a map and put up some illustrations and talk about what he's going through. And it sounds kind of fun. Fun isn't always a word you associate with history, but I was thinking this could be a way to put the reader basically on the train sitting next to Lincoln going through America as he's looking at a divided country changing very quickly on his way to become the president. And so I did it, and I worked very hard for about 2 weeks. I really studied what Lincoln was up to. I used a lot of different kinds of sources online and real books. And I began to have a kind of tingling sense that this is a great story. This isn't just something you do on a blog. This is an epic journey. And I used the word epic carefully, but I had grown up reading. I read Homer's Odyssey. I had a grandfather who loved it, who used to assign me chapters to read, and then he would quiz me. And I had a feeling this was an unusual, important journey, that Lincoln is obviously very important. I mean, he's the most important American who has ever lived, probably. I mean, we could debate that afterwards, but he's seeing a great deal of the country looking out the window, and the country is seeing him. And it has an epic feeling about it, including how difficult it was. And so as I studied the 13 days carefully, I was amazed at how hard each day was, that Lincoln was breaking down physically. His voice was going. He was exhausted. He wasn't sleeping well. The pressures of the crowds trying to get at him never stopped. And I mean, in some ways, it felt like a rock and roll tour, that people are trying to knock on his door in his hotel in the middle of the night and touch the hem of his garment. And it's a kind of interesting step towards celebrity culture, which is probably not my favorite topic, but it is important. And I thought it was important to see Lincoln that way, not only as the great president and writer and speaker that we know, but as someone who's interestingly stepping into the limelight of our celebrity obsession. It's not the greatest thing about our country, but it is true about our country, that we love people who are famous. We love them simply because they are famous. And that was happening to Lincoln. He was a relatively unknown nominee, and then he won the election, and then suddenly the country starts falling apart, and he seems to be the reason. So everyone wanted to see him. If they could see him in the flesh, they could perhaps understand why the country was falling apart. So it was a really pivotal 2-week moment in the story of the United States of America, and I just loved the topic from the moment I started it until when I finished. It took me 9 years. I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm not embarrassed to say that one of the reasons it took 9 years is that I did very deep research. I read every newspaper I could find that described Lincoln coming through a small town. And America is a very literate society, especially in the upper Midwest and the North. And as Lincoln is coming through all these hundreds of small towns and small cities in Illinois and Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, they all write about him. They all, every paper has a local staff. That's all they have. And it was the biggest story of 1861 that Abraham Lincoln was coming through a town. So I read, I was going to say hundreds, it was probably thousands of newspapers describing him, and it was really fun. And I got to know the country, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what it meant to be in a country that was falling apart. The United States of America seemed to be ending in February 1861 as 7 states seceded, and it was not at all clear that the incoming president-elect would even be able to make it to Washington, D.C., and that's a big part of the drama of the book, And the epic feeling of the book is that he's on a quest. He's on a quest to get to Washington, the capital, and save democracy, which amazingly he does. He actually did it, and against overwhelming odds. The odds were incredible, and he succeeded. The odds were against him to even make it to Washington because of all the people trying to assassinate him. I talk about that a lot in the book. And he was able to get through because some friends helped him, including 2 very brave women. And I'm really happy to have women in this story because women are not in very many Civil War books. And 2 extremely brave women, one a mental health advocate named Dorothea Dix from Massachusetts, heard about a plot to kill Lincoln and told a railroad executive who hired detectives to try to figure out what was going on. One of the detectives was a woman who impersonated a Southerner and found out everything you needed to know about the plot by just speaking in a Southern accent around Baltimore. She found out everything. So Lincoln has to get through so many obstacles only to get to Washington to take the hardest job in the world. And I thought it was fascinating to see him not quite fully formed. That's what Lincoln on the Verge means, but also to see him in motion, moving pretty fast on trains that were capable of going 60 miles an hour, moving with an entourage, people getting on and off. His family was with him, and he is a family man with young children and an older son. And that lends a certain intensity to the drama. An early TV interview in the spring for the release of this book with CBS this morning, I inadvertently said Lincoln's predicament reminded me of Chevy Chase in the National Lampoon Vacation movies, where he's got so many problems, and then his family is not behaving either. He's trying to reunite the American family of all the states that are not together, and then his family is also misbehaving. So that was a kind of comic element through the book. And then another element that I really appreciated, because I'm a former presidential speechwriter, and I've done a lot of different things. Happy to talk about that too, but I was a speechwriter for Bill Clinton in the late 90s, and I care a lot about the words spoken by presidents. I think that's an important form of American, I won't quite say literature, but of expression. And Lincoln is the best. He's the gold standard of American oratory. And in these 2 weeks, he's really working out what it is that he needs to say to the American people. And I thought that was one of the best parts of this book, was showing a struggling writer who I relate to profoundly, trying to say things better. And he really did an extraordinary job. I already said what the difficulty was of the journey, how hard the physical conditions were, and how his body was breaking down. But day after day, he went out there and he said something meaningful to the people gathered around at the back of the train, desperate to hear some words about the future of the country and how America might not be ending, how the United States might get through that crisis and live to see another day. And it began on the first day of his journey with an extraordinary short speech that he gave in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, a farewell to the town. And it was probably only about a minute long, but in that minute, he talked about what his neighbors had meant to him, what it meant to live in a small town. And Newport is bigger than Springfield, but I bet a lot of you know each other and can relate to what he was saying about how democracy begins in the social relationships we have, the way we talk over our back fences and do small favors for each other, and wait in line politely at the post office or the supermarket, just make sure everyone's okay. And he gave a beautiful speech about being a neighbor and being from a small town, and how much he loved his fellow residents of Springfield. And whether he knew he was being recorded or not, he wasn't being tape recorded, but the words were being transcribed. That speech was an enormous hit. Its words were telegraphed around the country immediately, and presented Lincoln as a thoughtful person and a normal person, and the kind of person you would like to represent you. And it was a brilliant and very unorthodox first step on this 13-day journey. No president had ever given a personal statement or a personal interview. Presidents went to the White House and then they became the chief executive of the American government. And here was Lincoln talking about himself as a real person right before getting on the train. And it was a brilliant improvisation and a brilliant piece of statecraft that, as it was read around the country, helped Americans to think this guy who's not very well known, who won with a tiny percentage of the vote, less than 40%, is okay. And it just started him on the right foot. And then for the next 13 days, he improvised again and again. He had written one speech per day. He is well organized, and he had a serious speech every day that he was going to go into a room to deliver, and he wrote it out. But reality was much more complicated. He had to give many more speeches than one a day, and so he just had to go out there and say what was on his mind in a way that was fantastic, because again, we got the real Lincoln, not just someone writing out a formal statement to deliver inside a room, but a man thinking on his feet in a way that Alexis de Tocqueville would have recognized as really important to democracy in America. And so Lincoln was funny. He was naturally funny. He was maybe our funniest president. Most of them have not been very funny. Although I don't want to get too political, but I want to say I'm not a supporter of the current president, but I do think he's kind of funny. And that's part of his huge success on social media. And even saying that, probably get 20 questions in Q&A, which I didn't mean to ask for. But I do think he's kind of funny. Anyway, Lincoln was naturally funny, very witty, had an endless supply of folky stories that he liked to tell. And he warmed up a crowd and then delivered the story and just sort of, kept those bonds of democracy going. There were some funny incidents along the ride, which were not intentionally funny, but one time he started to tell a kind of tall tale. In fact, the story was about how slow the train ride was. And then as he's in the middle of the story, this is where it gets really funny. The train started pulling away because they were on a tight schedule. So he was speeding up the story to try to get to the punchline, and the crowd started running after the train to hear the punchline, but they couldn't because there was too much information he had to get through to get to the punchline. So I love that. It's almost like Andy Kaufman, if any of you are friends of the comedian Andy Kaufman of the 80s and 90s, it's this sort of funny situation that's ridiculous even before the punchline is attempted. The situation is ridiculous. In another small town in upstate New York, he often was received by very formal reception committees. And in a small town in upstate New York, there was only 3 minutes on the schedule, and a dignitary started to give him an elaborate welcome and was using hand gestures and almost acting as if he was Cicero, sort of classical oratory, welcoming the great, important VIP Abraham Lincoln. And he had just turned it over to Lincoln to respond for the crucial moment where Lincoln would say, "I'm so happy to be in this small town." But he talked for so long that as he turned it over to Lincoln, the train pulled away and Lincoln just waved to everybody. So these human moments kept happening throughout the trip, and they were enjoyed by everyone and built up Lincoln's support at a time when he was pretty weak. He won with the second smallest popular vote in American history. Kind of amazing when you think about how incredibly famous Abraham Lincoln is, but his percentage of the vote was 39.8%, even less than Herbert Hoover when he lost to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. So in effect, this train trip was a form of campaigning by whistle stop after he had actually won the election. And I believe that it shored up his support in crucial ways and gave him confidence in himself and confidence from the people at a time of grave doubt about whether the United States of America could even continue. He also met with governors in all of these important states, and that became important a few months later because he needed to ask them for soldiers when the Civil War broke out. And the fact that he had seen each governor and each legislature made it that much easier to ask Indiana and Ohio and New York and Pennsylvania for soldiers to come defend Washington and begin to go into the South to fight the Civil War. So it's an extraordinary story of a man in trouble. Abraham Lincoln was in a lot of trouble because he'd won the election at the worst moment in our history to become president of the United States. He was also a writer in search of his voice. He was trying to find his voice. And I argue that near the end of the trip, as he came into Philadelphia, and movingly, he comes into Philadelphia just after hearing all of the warnings about the assassination plot waiting for him in Baltimore. And he goes into Independence Hall where the Declaration and Constitution were signed and gives a stunning, beautiful speech about what it all means, what America means, what the Declaration of Independence means, especially those soaring sentences in the second paragraph of the Declaration, which is where Lincoln really rooted his idea about what America is. And, we can certainly talk about that too. There are arguable different moments when the United States of America begins. But for Lincoln, it was clearly the Declaration and the second paragraph especially. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's where it began for Lincoln. The South also could have located its origin in the same document. That document is also about the right to begin a new government if you don't like the government you're living under. And Jefferson Davis might easily have said, "We are the people interpreting the Declaration, not you." But Jefferson Davis was not a very good speaker and not a very good writer. He was a more important person than Abraham Lincoln for most of their lives before 1861. He was a senator and a secretary of war and a distinguished officer in the Mexican War, but he hadn't really thought about the higher reaches of what it means to be American. And Lincoln, this poor kid with no college education, had really read books. And again, shout out to libraries and to the Redwood. As places that not only hold information, but hold moral and ethical values inside of them. And the Redwood does hold all of those things. I can't say enough how much I love the Redwood, and it's implicit in the way you walk into the Redwood. You are included. You are included, and the light floods in no matter what room you are in, and you are encouraged to pull a book off the shelf, and you are empowered. And Lincoln had educated himself, although he never went to college, and he didn't go to there were no high schools where he grew up. But he just read. He read in books, and he figured out what was important about America. And the idea was that everybody counts. And implicit in that idea was that the human beings who were enslaved in the South counted. And he had ingenious ways of attacking slavery without being quite as abolitionist as people from New England or William Seward, his chief political rival. But that he was abolitionist is undeniable. And he proved it during his presidency by abolishing slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation remains a complicated document because it mostly ended slavery where he had no power to end it in the states that were in rebellion. But in spite of that, it was a remarkable forward step for a president of the United States and for the United States to say that slavery was the enemy for the first time. And Lincoln got there with personal experience, but also very much through the reading of books. And I argue that when he came through Philadelphia on the last day of his trip, he was already pretty fully formed. He was not so far from the person who would speak at Gettysburg in the same state 2 years later. So in 13 days, he sees millions of Americans. He grows tremendously as a speaker and writer and as a kind of historian of the United States. He survives a very serious assassination attempt, and he gets to the Capitol where he can do the work he needs to do. But without the train trip, we never would have seen Abraham Lincoln become Abraham Lincoln. So that's my story.
Ted, thank you so much. It seems daunting to me when one thinks about Lincoln and all of the books that have been written. It's pretty gutsy to take him on. I mean, he's such a towering figure with so many different books, and your book in many ways is a sort of a micro history in a sense, that one episode. I'm just curious about how it feels to face up to that body of scholarship that is so enormous.
It was really intimidating, Benedict. I started the project without having really dealt with that body of scholarship, but one of the things I did in my 9 years was read much more in it. And we've had a long time to think about Abraham Lincoln, and in my opinion, a lot of the best biographies are older ones, not more recent ones. I think we're actually getting more forgetful about Lincoln. And there was a great heyday of Lincoln writing in the 1920s and 30s that produced some amazing work. And I think the work in recent years has been a little less amazing in some ways. But it was a joy to really drop down into it. And I was lucky. I mentioned earlier, I'm in Providence, and Brown has a fantastic collection of Lincoln material in the John Hay Library, and the Providence Athenæum, which is a kind of sister library to the Redwood, also is just very strong in 19th century material. John Hay, who was Lincoln's secretary, spent a lot of time in the Athenæum. And so there were ways around Providence that I could read. I could read Lincoln, and that was very gratifying. But yeah, it's scary. It's scary to take on the most famous president who has ever been. He's about the only president that President Trump seems intimidated by. He mentions him a fair amount. And he had that interview at the foot of the statue in the Lincoln Memorial about a half a year ago. And so even to Donald Trump, who seems so unintimidated by so many people and by so much of American history, Lincoln looms large. He still is a huge figure. And he remains complicated. Earlier this week, I think it was Monday night, a Lincoln statue was torn down in Portland, Oregon, by protesters protesting an act of, well, it was an execution of a lot of Sioux warriors in Minnesota in the middle of the Civil War, and Lincoln approved it. And so it was a kind of act of protest against Abraham Lincoln. And in this year when we've seen so much emotion about history in so many different ways. And I was bothered by that. I'm generally a pretty liberal guy, but I didn't think Lincoln was the right enemy. And I thought the protesters were poorly informed, and I would rather see a civic process in which a lot of people come together and think about history rather than an act of vandalism in the middle of the night. I don't support that. And Lincoln would not have either. Lincoln actually got in a fair amount of trouble with his own base because he said, we may not like the Fugitive Slave Act, but we signed up for it. It was a legal instrument that part of the Compromise of 1850, the North got some things that it wanted, but the South got some things that it wanted, including a promise that any slave who escaped into the North and was identified would be returned to his or her rightful owner in the South. And Lincoln said, I don't like it either, but we signed up for it, and so we have to agree to it. And we want to end slavery, but we want to do it through legal means if possible. So I'm in favor of normal civic processes to work out these pretty bitter arguments over our history. But it's a tough time. There are emotions spilling over on both sides. And I'm not sure the center can constrain either the left or the right now. It's just each side fuels anger on the other. And I was surprised to see Lincoln now being torn down as a statue this week. But I think he will be part of our recovery too, the way he has been so many times. And so, I don't want to get too political in a history talk, but if we go in a new direction in November, I hope Lincoln can be an example of the kind of president who brought Americans back together, which he certainly did at the end of the Civil War. He was reaching out very beautifully to the South and saying he wanted them to come back in. And I don't think he would have called them traitors. He would have called them fellow Americans who took the wrong path for a few years. And I think maybe that's a healthier way to think. We are getting into a trend. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that because I don't know how the election will turn out, but we may be getting into a transition in November and December and January. And if so, Lincoln is again helpful to us because the way he handled his own transition was really good. And I talk about that in my book also, that he really was in a tough spot. He had won with this meager percentage of the vote. He was very far away and not in very close contact with his fellow Republicans, and they're trying to put a cabinet together and nobody is in agreement. And then he's got to come on this harrowing trip through America to get to Washington. And it was a rough transition that the founders, with all their brilliance, they did not anticipate how hard it would actually be to end one presidency and then start another, especially when emotions were very high. And we may be a very technologically sophisticated people. Obviously we are, but it is really hard to shut down a presidency and then start a new one with tens of thousands of jobs at stake, especially if there's a lot of emotion and hatred between the two different administrations. That's really hard. And the founders just kind of assumed it would all be gentlemanly in the way it was in the era of Peter Harrison and the building of the Redwood and the founding of the United States. But now in a country of, what are we, 330 million people, and Facebook and Google and all kinds of other social media, and deliberately stoked emotions, it's really hard to shut down a presidency and start a new one. So we're heading into some stormy waters, but I hope Lincoln's example can help us again.
I mean, in many ways, he reminds of Mandela post-apartheid, the way that he this reconciliation, this idea of bringing people together. Which brings me to the timing of your book. I mean, it took you 9 years, and then bang, here it is, right at a time that is so pregnant. How did you time it so perfectly?
I took too long. I wish I was smarter than I am. I would have loved if it came out about 2 or 3 years ago, and I just took forever. I had a lot of other things I was working on, and then I did drop down very deep into the research, as I said, and I had many people yelling at me to get it out quicker, including I had a wonderful editor named Alice Mayhew, who was a kind of legendary editor at Simon & Schuster, who died in February of this year, and she was able to read the finished book, which I'm happy about. But I just was a perfectionist, and I kept trying to fix things I had already written. I'd also written too much, and Alice was helpful that way. Alice said I had to lose about a third of it, which is very hard to do, and that took about a year in which I was near Newport. I was in South County, actually, working on getting rid of a third of this book. And it was painful, but I'm so happy Alice made me do that. And if there are other writers on the call, you know how hard it is. But she would give me a word count for each chapter and say 5,000 words you have to cut from this chapter. And it was brutal, but I did it. And when the pandemic hit, the book came out April 7th. It seemed like the worst timing imaginable, because I had all these physical in-person talks scheduled around the country. They were all canceled. Every single one was canceled. And I thought, this is a catastrophe. And I also had problems with the delivery of the actual physical book. In April and May, the pandemic was so severe that truck drivers were not out there in the usual numbers. And so Simon & Schuster's ability to deliver the book around the country was affected. And a lot of stores didn't have the books as the publicity was beginning. So it was a nightmare. But having said that, the miracle of Zoom has been such a blessing, and I've loved it, and I'm enjoying our talk tonight. And I like Zoom, to be honest, a lot more than being in person. I love coming to the Redwood, and I am a member, but it would be me trying to read something off a printed piece of paper that I couldn't see very well with my glasses, it's a little more intimate and real. It's like you and I are having a conversation, and it's actually really good. And I've loved my Zoom talks, and I think maybe I'm going to knock on wood. I think I've gained as much as I have lost by the book coming out at this time. And then, yes, the transition coming up is really relevant to my book. And so I'm hoping that will drive some new readership. And I know a paperback is coming out pretty soon, and I've heard some encouraging things about. I believe Barnes and Noble is about to start a push for this book. So you work so hard, and you can't really control the moment of the release, and you can't control what's going on in the country at the moment of the release. But you can just be ready to adapt. And, in a way, that's what Lincoln was. Lincoln is using the telegraph in very versatile ways and new speaking styles. He's adapting. And in my much more humble way, I'm trying to adapt to this moment also.
We've got a couple questions here. Why was the Declaration of Independence so important to Lincoln?
That's a great question. Lincoln has a lifelong attachment to that document. I believe he read it in his late teenage years, and it was inside a book of Indiana statutes, and he was thinking of becoming a lawyer. So he's got that book. He's reading the laws of Indiana, but there, very near the front, is the Declaration. And he thought a lot about it, and he begins to talk about why America's government is great. As a young man, his neighbors described him standing on tree stumps and giving speeches about why we have to do everything we can to preserve this precious form of government that we live under. And as he became more sophisticated in his later years, he still kept coming back to the Declaration. And I worked at the Library of Congress for a year, and I was able to see some items from his personal collection. One was a scrapbook that he kept for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And inside the cover of this sort of, it was kind of a chapbook, he had cut out and pasted in the paragraph he most liked from the Declaration of Independence. So if he lost himself in the debate with Douglas, he could keep coming back to those immortal words. And it was something emotional. It wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional for him, that he felt that giving everyone a chance, treating people fairly, was at the heart of this new experiment. And we're in a very, very complicated time in our country. And there's a lot of anger at American history. And we had Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. And not too many months before that, the Me Too movement. And there are a lot of angry people who have been marginalized because of their gender or their race. And I hear that, and I'm pretty liberal in most ways, but where I part company is abandoning this central idea of America, that everybody gets a chance, that is embedded in the Declaration. It's present, although a little bit less central to the Constitution, which is a very complicated document, but it's really there, soaring in the Declaration of Independence, which, as Lincoln pointed out, throughout the 1850s, as he's rising in stature, the Declaration might have merely been what it calls itself. It might have been a Declaration of Independence saying, we are no longer a part of England. Have a nice day. That would have been a perfectly decent Declaration of Independence. What it actually is a philosophical manifesto calling for a better way of living, of human beings living amongst each other, treating each other decently, giving everyone a chance to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, those are pretty vague terms, but we know roughly what they mean. And Lincoln believed in that philosophy, and he believed that a corner had been turned on July 4th, 1776, and that it was up to subsequent generations to make it better, that whatever was imperfect in 1776, try to chip away at and make it better in 1861. By the way, throughout his presidency, he's saying everything I'm doing is not only for today, it's for what he called the vast future. It was for every year and actually every person on earth, not just citizens of the United States, but everybody. So your mention of Mandela, Benedict, is right on. I think Lincoln would have absolutely approved of Nelson Mandela, both his struggle and then his incredible generosity toward his former jailers and all the things he did to make a more tolerant South Africa possible.
Let me ask this question that has just come. In your research, did you find any of his daily habits or personality traits that helped him to persevere under such extreme pressure? When reading those local newspaper articles, were you able to gauge a sense of bias in the journalism between different states?
Oh, another great question. They like him in the upper Midwest. I mean, there's diversity of opinion, but they largely are thrilled that a Midwesterner has been elected. New York is a little more complicated. And actually, there are places I was sort of amused to see that, he's always in trouble for being too anti-slavery. And the South is mad at him for that. And the Democratic Party, he's a Republican. The Democratic Party is accusing him of being too anti-slavery. When he gets into places that are very anti-slavery, like Cleveland, Ohio, or Rochester, New York, he's suddenly not anti-slavery enough. So I was amused to read some criticism of Lincoln from the left, that he was just, ridiculously in the center and not where he needed to be morally, which sort of reminded me of the way Joe Biden might be criticized by the progressive left of the Democratic Party right now. But then as he gets into New York City, there's a lot of dislike of Lincoln in New York. New York, then and now, is a complicated place. Unlike now, it was not so clearly a progressive place. And New York had a lot of trade with the South and a lot of worry about Lincoln. The mayor of New York didn't like Lincoln and loved the South, and had even talked about New York becoming a kind of independent city that had equal trading rights with the North and the South. So Lincoln had to deal with some hostility in New York City. And then Pennsylvania was sort of neutral. There was some pro and con. But then the second he goes from Pennsylvania to Maryland, they're right next to each other. Implacable hatred and a desire to kill him. So that's pretty hostile opposition. In Baltimore, there was a serious assassination attempt, which he eluded only by, after the warnings from the women I mentioned, going through on a commuter train in the middle of the night, 4 a.m. He got through Baltimore and made it to Washington at dawn. But he probably would have been targeted with an assassination attempt, not in 1865, but in 1861, if he'd gone through Baltimore in the middle of the day. So he's dealing with all kinds of opposition throughout the trip. And he uses humor very well in those small town audiences. But at the end of the trip, he went to a deeper form of self-protection, which was going through all night on a commuter train in an ordinary passenger compartment.
What about the Rhode Island angle? You're from Rhode Island. We know that Rhode Island wasn't part of the trip, but give us a bit of context as far as Lincoln and Rhode Island for all our viewers.
So he came here once. He comes on this trip through New England in February and March of 1860. The highlight of that trip was the Cooper Union address. It's an important speech Lincoln gives in New York City in a building that is still there in Astor Place called the Cooper Union. And it's a knockout speech in which he really indicts the South for all the ways it's corrupting democracy. It's not Lincoln and the Republicans. It's the South who have failed to live up to the spirit of American democracy. And he talks about the founders and how they wanted to get rid of slavery, but they expected later generations to do it. And Lincoln is saying, that's us, so now let's do it. And it's a brilliant speech. And then immediately afterwards, he comes to Providence and gives a speech in downtown, very near City Hall, if you know downtown Providence, near Haven Brothers. You know it very, very well. That's the nighttime food truck. It's been there for about 100 years, and the food often tastes that way. Then I'd love to tell you he went to Newport, but intriguingly, he went to Woonsocket. Hard to explain why Lincoln went and gave a speech in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, but he did. So that was a second night of his short Rhode Island visit, and he did well in both Providence and Woonsocket, and then he continued. His son Robert Todd Lincoln was a student at Exeter in New Hampshire, so he went up there, but he crisscrossed Massachusetts, and it was a kind of campaigning trip. He did not have the nomination yet, but he was talking to New Englanders and trying to build up some support to get the nomination. And then he came through Hartford, and something important happened in Hartford. I just wrote about it. And if any of you read The Guardian, the wonderful English newspaper, The Guardian, on Saturday, I wrote a piece about what happened when Lincoln went to Hartford on March 5th, 1860. A group of young men who liked him, but they were not part of the Republican Party, formed a kind of assembly to escort him from his speech to his hotel, and they had designed a new look for themselves, which included they were carrying torches so they could walk at night, and they had capes with oilcloth, so if the torch leaked oil, they would be protected. And the capes looked great, and the torches looked great, and they began to call themselves the Wide Awakes. And it was like a youth movement that spread all around the country, all around the North. And throughout the year 1860, young people loved joining the Wide Awakes and marching with Republicans or without Republicans, just to go to rallies and set off fireworks and show that they were not afraid of the South, and they wanted to take their idea of America back. And so that began on that same trip that he came through Rhode Island. But I regret to say he did not come through Newport. He did not set foot on Aquidneck Island.
Okay. Ted, we're right at one hour. We don't want to exploit you further. It was really, so informative, really amazing, and make a great movie.
There is actually a little TV interest. I don't know where it's going, but the book has been optioned by Sony, and we're beginning to talk about maybe a TV series. So we will. I don't know. This is a new frontier for me, but we will see where it goes. But I'd love to come back to the Redwood Benedict in person when that becomes possible, and to see my many, many friends from Newport. And also, if anyone wants to email me, it's very easy. It's ted_widmer@brown.edu, and I'd be happy to email you back. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It was really amazing. And I know that all the viewers really appreciate it. So thank you. Okay. And for everyone still looking on, I want to make you aware, next Wednesday on the 28th, we have Professor Evan Wilson from the Naval War College, who is going to speak to us about War at Sea and the Age of Sail, the campaign of Trafalgar. And so that will be next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Once again, I want to thank Ted Widmer for a fascinating talk, and I want to thank everybody that signed on to take part this evening. And by all means, if you haven't joined, please do. And when you get on our YouTube channel, don't hesitate to subscribe. So once again, thank you, everyone, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much.